The FBI may have a file on you that includes your DNA, even if you've never been convicted of a crime. I'm Scott Ott, and this is Bill Whittle Now. And Bill, a law is going into effect this year that was actually signed by President Trump back in 2017 to use what's called rapid DNA technology that essentially uses a device about the size of a computer printer to be able to run a quick DNA test on somebody. And under the terms of the law, not only do the police have the ability to take that DNA sample even on your arrest when you've not been convicted of a crime, but they can immediately upload that to a national federal database called CODIS, and within a very short period of time, you're on the grid, so to speak, and your whole genetic code is as well. Bill, first of all, before we get into much more detail on this, and I'm not going to get into much more detail on it, I just think that this is an issue that if you're a liberty lover, you need to talk about. What's your gut instinct when you hear about a federal database of DNA of people who aren't convicted of crimes?
My gut instinct is it's time to run away as fast as you can and as far as you can go. I think it was Robert Heinlein who said, anytime you live in a society that requires ID badges, it's time to move. And there is no more compelling ID badge than your genetic blueprint. So sometimes in a case like this, when we're trying to figure out where the decent and common sense vector is, sometimes the best thing to do is to look at both ends of the spectrum. So on one end of the spectrum, we ban DNA identification completely, and we lose it as a tool in terms of prosecuting crimes. And I think that would be a mistake. I think it's extremely valuable, not only to prove people guilty, but also, I think even more importantly, it's extremely valuable to prove people who are falsely accused and prove them innocent. So I think the technology has a place in a free society, and I don't think that it inherently is bad. But the idea of a DNA database is essentially the idea that every citizen is a potential criminal, and it's just a matter of time until they actually slip up and commit the crime. And this, to me, is a police state and reprehensible to everybody's idea of what a free country should be. So I think the solution is actually pretty simple on this one, Scott. I think now enforcing this would be a little tougher because you never know what goes on in the computer drives of the deep state. But ideally, I think what would be a pretty reasonable compromise is if you are arrested for a crime and during the time that you're held there while they're waiting to decide whether they have reasonable case for charges to be brought against you, if they decide that they have a reasonable case for charges to be brought against you, then I think at that point you shouldn't have to be convicted in order to have the DNA test. But certainly the same protections that would apply to keeping you in prison, probable cause, and a writ for, a warrant for investigating your house, let's say. I think the way to look at this is, I think there needs to be a warrant in order to have a DNA test. And furthermore, I think that test should be, I was going to say should be voluntary, but I can see why a mass murderer maybe wouldn't want to volunteer the DNA. But in any event, some kind of legal protection to make sure that a due process of law and our Fourth Amendment protections are in place. And then after that point, if it turns out that the DNA shows that you were a naughty, naughty person, then we use that technology in order to enforce laws, prevent crime, and put criminals in jail.
Is there any difference between this and the customary taking of fingerprints upon booking somebody in an arrest? Is this just a difference of kind or intensity, or is this really a whole different world?
There is no difference between the two from a philosophical standpoint, certainly that I can think of. I mean, up until DNA technology, in fact, up until the present day, fingerprints are unique, and when you are fingerprinted, you are basically going to prove or disprove a case within the limited range of what fingerprints can do. Is there a clean print on the gun? Is there a clean print on the glass with the lipstick on it and the poison ice cubes and all the rest of that stuff? So yes, you are being identified against your will when you have fingerprints taken, and to some degree when you go down to the bank and sign a check or whatever, or a driver's license, you put your thumbprint there. You're essentially doing the same thing that the DNA results do, but with one very, very important distinction, The fingerprint identifies your identity, and that's all it does. It identifies you as the unique owner of that fingerprint and provides no additional information. DNA testing provides a wealth of information, and my concern is, among many concerns, that this access to this depth of information may be used in some sort of, I don't want to say a profiling way exactly, but look, it's a philosophical issue, and clearly we can go to both ends of these extremes. We can look at a society where freedom is so paramount that crimes go unpunished and innocent people are put to jail, and that's because everybody's running around, and liberty has responsibilities, and a society, in order to actually function, as opposed to being some kind of idyllic sort of world where everything is taken care of. In the real world, there are criminals, and in the real world, these criminals do terrible things. And in the real world, DNA allows us to identify those criminals, punish them, put them in jail, or put them away, or put them to death if the case warrants it. So I don't think you just simply give up that technology, but the entire moral objection to a DNA database is the presumption of guilt. That's really, I think, ultimately it. It's the presumption of guilt. The idea that they've got your irreplaceable, well, not irreplaceable,
unmistakable,
unfakeable data. Yeah, yes, exactly. They've got it, and the second that you get arrested, boy, you're going to be pulled up to this database. I think a very good compromise in terms of if this could be enforced, and the only reason it couldn't be enforced would be by the government breaking the law, but that's a pretty big hurdle, actually. But I think what would be an excellent philosophical compromise would be that if there is probable cause on the part of law enforcement, and if a warrant can be obtained, then your DNA sample could be obtained, used to prove whether you did or did not do this thing. And certainly upon acquittal, and I'm still thinking about upon conviction, but certainly upon acquittal, that information should be destroyed. It simply needs to be destroyed.
Well, Bill, I think you and I both know that no information ever gets destroyed. Let me just ask you, though.
That's where the big problem is.
I hate to go all sci-fi thriller on you here, but I can imagine a scenario where eventually we have a large database of DNA from various Americans, some of whom have been involved in commission of crimes, some of whom have not, and just happen to be at the wrong place at the wrong time. And, the credit card companies can't even keep a hold of my data securely. Who's to say that some malevolent character doesn't get a hold of this DNA database and not only find out things about my personal situation, but maybe finds out what I have allergy to, what I am susceptible to, medical information about me that could be used in forms of blackmail or to jeopardize my very life.
And this is what differentiates DNA from fingerprints and why it's more powerful and therefore more useful and more dangerous. But I think you really hit on the real essence of the issue just a moment ago, and that was when you mentioned that information is never destroyed. This is the genuine, if not the greatest threat to the republic, it's in the top three. The idea that information storage now is so inexpensive compared to at least the alternative, that it is possible to record every single, and not only possible, it's being done. Right now you're watching this on a computer, on a mobile, or whatever you're watching it on. The click that you made in order to watch this video has been recorded. There's no question about it. Every single mouse click you have ever made, certainly within the last 20 years, has been recorded. Every single one of them has been recorded someplace. And Google is sucking up all of this information, and which is why when we talked about Jeff Bezos and his desire to create an information state being burned by release of personal information, at the very least there was some Schadenfreude in there, and perhaps it's a cautionary tale enough to get them to change their behavior, but I doubt that to be the case. But look, Scott, this is an issue. This is, I think, probably the primary civil rights issue of our age, and that is the inability for us to know when information has been collected and when it's been destroyed. We have a Fourth Amendment to protect our privacy and our papers and so on, and keeping papers private is actually relatively simple compared to keeping electronic data that's being dispersed upon thousands of different routes to its destination. So we had better think very seriously about the kind of legislation and the kind of teeth behind legislation, and the kind of watchdog organizations as well, to make sure that not only that the FBI doesn't maintain this doesn't maintain this DNA database, but companies like Facebook, when you decide to close your Facebook account, it destroys the information. It's gone. And this has to be enforceable, and it has to be independently verifiable. The first time I ever had an inclination of what was coming was 10 years ago, a while ago anyways, 8 years ago. I deactivated my Facebook account, and then a couple months later I decided to start it again. I reactivated the new account, and all my old pictures were there. I had closed the account. I had deleted it. And the second I fired it back up again, here's all my old pictures. Isn't that convenient for me? Why were you keeping those? I know you were keeping them because on page 97 of the document that we all clicked, that we read, that nobody ever reads. But if we're serious about this, and we should be, then information security needs to have Fourth Amendment standards applied to it. And once again, if we don't do this, we have no one to blame but ourselves. When somebody comes snooping in and says, we detected your DNA in a Starbucks that was within 200 yards of a murder scene, we'd like to ask you some questions.
Well, let me take it to one final level for the final question here. As I mentioned earlier, President Trump signed this back in, I believe it was February of 2017. It takes effect this year. So you've got a Republican president signing this, and Republicans have historically been tough on crime. But there's an interesting aspect of this, because what we're doing is we're essentially federally deputizing local law enforcement agents to turn over individual records of potentially non-convicted persons to the federal government. What kind of concerns does that raise for you?
It raises every concern that the founders ever had in terms of our Fourth Protection rights, about unreasonable search and seizure. It represents the beginning of the kind of state that everyone should fear, and that none of us had thought we would see in America, and that half of us still oppose seeing in America. And I think you can get to the heart of the issue, Scott, by not even talking about DNA at all. I think the heart of the issue comes down to something much simpler than that, and that is the presumption of innocence. And if you have a society with the presumption of innocence, where the burden of proof is on the prosecution, on the part of the law, then you are going to see guilty people go free, because there are going to be many crimes that are committed where there is not a sufficient level of evidence to clear the bar of the burden of proof. In a society where you have the presumption of innocence, you are going to see crimes go unpunished. Now the question is, would you rather live in that kind of world, or would you rather live in a world where there's the presumption of guilt, where you have to prove that you didn't do something? And for me, and for the founders, and for everybody who's watching this, at least who are regularly watching this, this is a no-brainer. While all of us find the idea abhorrent that murderers can go free, and I'm talking to you, O.J. Simpson, then we have to accept the fact that this is the price of the presumption of innocence, that we don't have a world where we can look into the souls and history and open up a time portal and see what actually happened. We are left in a world where there is inconclusiveness and ambiguity, and we decided as a people that we would rather see criminals go free than face the more abhorrent idea of having innocent people put away or put to jail or put to death for something that they didn't do. So the entire DNA database issue comes to me down to the presumption of innocence. And if you presume that your society is innocent until proven guilty, then there is no justification whatsoever to hold an information database. You can, with the same protections that we have in terms of search warrants and all the rest, you can say that now there is sufficient reason to believe that this kind of identification is warranted, literally warranted by the meaning of the word.
Perhaps by a secret FISA-type court, Bill?
No, Scott, by the same kind of court that you should have in order to get a police warrant for anything else. You should be able to sit in as a private citizen. You should be able to sit in a courtroom, as far as I'm concerned, sit in a courtroom and listen to a district attorney make a case for a search warrant on anybody. This procedure ought to, I don't know whether it is or not. That's just plain ignorance on my part. But if it's not the case, then it should be. You should be able to go in and have the population monitor the arguments that are being made for and against these kind of things, and decent, reasonable people will come to the right conclusion.
The trouble with that is once you sit in that courtroom, they've got your DNA.
Haha. So who do we have to blame for this? You know, ultimately, when you come down to all the loss of the freedoms, who do you have to blame for this? Do you blame people that are power-hungry control freaks? Well, you can't blame them. They've always been here. They always will be here. They're built into the human species. It's just a genetic defect, and that's the way it goes. But they're there. And so the question becomes, are we willing to let them do it? And more often, it seems, we find ourselves simply going along with things that we know to be dangerous and wrong because, first of all, it's convenient. And secondly, much more importantly, it's the old analogy of the Cadillac and the Pinto trying to merge into the same lane. One guy's got a brand new, $60,000 Cadillac. The other guy's got a 20-year-old beat-up Pinto, and they're trying to get into the same lane. Which one's going to blink first? Well, the guy driving the Cadillac's going to blink first because he's got a brand new car. He doesn't need a dent on it, and the Pinto doesn't care because it's beat to hell already. And we're all driving Cadillacs now. That's the problem. We're all driving Cadillacs now with so much to lose, and when we look at these things, we say, well, I don't like it, but, I don't know, it's really worth getting my gun for. And so, there you go. But we are responsible for the world that we're making for ourselves one way or another. And I think this issue needs to be taken very seriously. And if we had any actual conservatives in the government instead of Republicans, somebody would be taking up this cause. And furthermore, I not only think this is important, I think this is an election issue that would win a lot of traction with the American people.
Well, we do have some conservatives among the members at BillWhittle.com. They are the people that make it possible for us to spread these messages around the world. So we would just want to express again our gratitude to them and encourage you, if you're not one yet, to become one by going to BillWhittle.com and clicking that Become a Member link. So for Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members at BillWhittle.com for making this possible.